Hello, I'm Ciarán Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc sheep podcast. Each episode will bring you latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. We're joined in this week's episode by Dr. James O'Shaughnessy from the Department of Agriculture's Central Veterinary Research Laboratory in Backweston in a broad discussion around the risk fluke poses this winter. We discuss the forecasted fluke risk this winter and how it can vary across the country and indeed among farms. James discusses detection, sources of information and the importance of previous farm history. We move on to discuss treatment options and the importance of choosing an appropriate flukicide for this point of the season. Finally, we finish up discussing rumen fluke and the risk it can pose. We start off, however, with James explaining the impact liver fluke can have on animal health, everything from acute to chronic infection.
Liver fluke, by definition, its effects in sheep are much more pronounced than in cattle. So sheep are far more susceptible to fluke than cattle. So you can have three different types or three different forms of disease. So acute fluke, which is occurs in sheep. It's very rare in cattle. What you typically see in this case is basically sheep are, you can get sheep, we call it, they have abdominal pain. You can get sudden deaths, and they become very anemic. And it's due to the migration of the juvenile fluke through the liver, causing extensive damage. And the course of the disease can be very, very short. In these cases, you won't see fluke eggs in a fecal sample. So if you take a fecal sample, you won't see any fluke eggs in it. The next type then is subacute fluke. So again, common in sheep, and not really common in cattle. Typically see this, say, October, November time, up to December even. So again, the kind of signs you'd expect to see in animals would be inappetence. So productivity is going to be impaired because they're infected. So weight loss. Again, they can suffer. You can see signs of anemia. And also you can see signs of bottle jaw as well, which also is I suppose is even more common in chronic fluke. So again, chronic fluke in sheep, but it's the most common form we'd see in cattle. Chronic fluke is generally later in the year, so it's typically December, January, February onwards. And what you will see in chronic fluke is you will detect eggs in fecal samples. So it's important to understand that when cattle or sheep are grazing, if they pick up the metascardia, the infective stage, off pasture, it's a minimum of about 8 weeks before you'll see eggs shed in that fecal sample. So prior to that, you won't see any eggs being shed. So it can be more difficult to detect whether or not the sheep, more commonly in sheep, whether or not they're actually infected with fluke in the first place. So things like previous history of fluke in the farm, other things like, unfortunately some animals go for post-mortem in a regional lab and they will be able to detect acute fluke. There's characteristic signs in the liver of juvenile fluke. Now you can obviously take blood samples and you'll see elevated liver enzymes, and you can also see reduced blood protein, so albumin is reduced.
James, it's something can have a massive impact in the flock if it hits. And I suppose, just like maybe put in context, there's no resistance to fluke in ewes, unlike worms and other things. They're not going to get over. So when it hits, it hits.
Yeah, no, it's a continual problem in sheep flocks. Like cattle are less susceptible to fluke, but they still are affected. And to actually, I suppose, broaden it out a bit. I mean, fluke can affect, say, cattle, sheep, and goats, for example. You can also see it in rabbits and hares. Deer would also be another. They can be affected by fluke. Horses less commonly. So like it can be seen across a range of animal species, but typically, yeah, you're talking about on your average farm, you're talking about sheep being far more affected than cattle would be. But nonetheless, it can have a serious constraint even in cattle herds, an impaired productivity, etc., associated with chronic disease. But in sheep, yeah, you're more likely to see acute disease, or you can get, deaths, etc.
And likely, look, the grazing behaviour is likely one of the reasons maybe to pick up more infection, but certainly our grazing management during the winter and maybe the lack or shorter housing period has a big impact on how we control it too. And look, we might come back to some aspects of that. James, in terms of fluke, look, it varies in terms of the risk profile throughout the country, and you produce a forecast every year looking at this and looking at what the potential burden is. You might just explain that to me, the forecast itself and what it's telling us.
Well, yeah, each year Met Éireann produce I suppose a disease forecast. It's called the Allairnshaw Index. So it uses parameters such as rainfall totals together with the number of rain days. So days with rain that are greater than equal to 2.2 millimeters of rain, and estimates of potential evapotranspiration. So it's basically looking over the period from May to October each year for this particular index. So it predicts the risk of disease or infection with liver fluke for that. Typically by the time the forecast is produced in November, so it's over the course of the winter. It predicts the risk of infection in animals, in cattle and sheep at pasture, but that stage they're housed. It predicts the challenge they're going to experience. So this year's index is quite similar to last year as regards just what it's predicting this year. It's predicting infection to be prevalent in the west and northwest, with occasional losses in the Midlands, East Munster and North Leinster. Little or no losses are expected along the southern coastal fringes and in South Leinster. Now, it has to be pointed out that there is most definitely farm-to-farm variation. There's some farms, whether they're in the east or the west, may be drier or wetter than a neighbouring farm. So maybe much at local level, there can be large differences in the likelihood of fluke occurring. But saying that, like, the risk overall would be higher in the west and northwest compared to the rest of the country.
And if you think about this year, like, by and large, the west and northwest got more or less the same levels of rainfall, or certainly they got an amount of it to keep habitats there, whereas the east, that prolonged dry period in the east had to have an effect on it.
Yeah, like I just looked at I'd say the results of 7 weather stations in the west and northwest compared to last year, and I think the risk is comparable to last year. So people that experienced fluke on their farms last year in the west and northwest, like the risk will be pretty much the same this year.
It's definitely something not to take your eye off, and perhaps we could be a little bit of a risk there. We think the great summer is going to be less, but when you look at the actual figures, it's not going to be that much different. There's another aspect, James, of how you're monitoring this. The Orvale's conduct a survey every year. I suppose it's a post-mortem study on liver fluke. You might just explain what they're actually looking at there and the kind of results they're seeing.
From 2015 onwards, the department were collecting essentially lambs going to slaughter in various meat plants. They've been collecting blood samples from a proportion of flocks at the time of slaughter. So what they're looking at, they're looking for the presence of liver fluke antibodies in lambs. So it kind of, over the course of, it's typically done from July onwards. Well, their samples are collected from June to right through up to the end of the year, but it allows us to kind of see when lambs are first exposed on farm in different parts of the country. So lambs, by definition, won't have experienced fluke before. So springborn lambs, whatever. But so by the time they're sampled in the meat plant, like, they're a good indicator of when exposure is occurring on farms in different counties, for example. So it tells you where the risk is higher or not going to be. Just looking at the figures for July and August. So in July, there was number of flocks tested was 130, given a positive rate of 8.5%. In August, then that started to creep up a bit, where you had 26.3% of flocks tested positive. So you can see, over time, as you go later into the grazing season, you're getting that greater level of exposure. And I suppose one thing I want to point out is the forecast itself if you go back to the actual the forecast itself is based on data from May to October every year. So we get the data from Met Éireann in the early days of November. So they compile the data. It takes time to compile the data, but there already will have been cases of acute fluke, particularly in west and northwest counties. I mean, you'll start to see acute fluke from autumn time onwards. So before this disease forecast is produced, so it is important for people up the west and northwest, in particular, not to be waiting on the production of this forecast before they're deciding when to treat, because losses will already have potentially taken place from acute disease.
I think that study is interesting, the ELISA study, because it's just the difference from July at that 8% up to August 26%. I suppose, James, we moved that into September, October, them numbers are going to increase a lot. It's at that stage of the year where that risk is becoming very obvious.
Real.
Your risk of your acute is really kicking in from then on.
Yeah. And that goes back then to, you're getting that acute risk of acute disease in autumn time, again before this forecast is produced, because this forecast is really looking at risk over late the winter period. So at that particular time of the year, depending on farm history, previous years' exposure levels, etc., and data coming back from slaughter plants, and using stuff like the abattoir ELISA survey, farmers would want to be using at that stage of the year flukicides that are effective against not just chronic disease or later stage fluke, but they'd want to be looking at treating all stages of fluke, or immature, early and late immatures, not to be just using products that are only effective against adult liver fluke.
Just touch on treatment, like just in terms of monitoring, I suppose a lot of sheep farms are going to have cattle as well, and Animal Ireland have been looking at this for a number of years as well. Like, what kind of numbers are you getting back this year on the cattle side of it?
Yeah, well, just a bit of background on the Animal Health Ireland Beef Health Check Programme. So it's run in partnership with Meat Industry Ireland. So essentially they collect and report liver fluke information in cattle at slaughter from various meat plants across the country. So their data would suggest that this year's levels of liver fluke infection are very similar to those reported in 2021. So, for example, to date, abattoir examinations showed an average of 44% of herds with at least one animal with liver damage due to liver fluke, and live fluke were seen in 13% of herds. Now, even more importantly, counties in the northwest of Ireland were more heavily affected. So, with 70 to 80% of herds in Sligo, Roscommon, and Donegal reported to have signs of liver fluke at slaughter. So, for as you say, people with mixed enterprises, it's really useful information to have to get information back from abattoirs, cattle going for slaughter, to see essentially what state the livers are in. Is there fluke present? And if there's not live fluke present, is there evidence that fluke were present?
And look, it's tying in with other data again, showing from the forecasts that the west and northwest is the high risk region. Look, just in terms in monitoring, you've touched on a number of aspects of it, but still on farms, there's lambs being sent to the abattoir for slaughter. Fecal samples, James. What other levels of monitoring can a farmer do if he wants to check, well, do I need to go back in and dose with fluke again? I'm assuming the lambs are a good example at this time of the year for the grazing outdoors to get a report back on the livers.
Apart from the actual forecast itself, I mean, fecal sampling is fine if there's adult fluke present. When we talk about acute disease where you're not going to see any eggs in a fecal sample, so if you take a fecal sample, send it to the lab, it comes back negative. Well, it just tells you that there's in a case of acute disease, you're just not going to have eggs present. So in those sort of situations, what else can you use? So you can use previous farm history as a very strong one to use. So if you've had fluke present on a farm before, and if the weather conditions this year are similar to the weather conditions last year, well, you can expect a similar level of risk. You can use the forecast, but the forecast is a little bit later, been by the very nature of how it's produced. Farms will already have had acute disease on farm. So in those situations, those lambs, if you get acute acute disease in farms. So any lambs that are they're essentially dying farm, or if you're not sure what's the cause, but submitting them to a regional veterinary laboratory, they'll quickly be able to identify whether or not this is due to liver fluke. So they'll see the juvenile fluke in the actual liver. So the juvenile fluke goes through the liver, they do tremendous damage, and you get a lot of bleeding in the liver, etc., etc. So this can be picked up on a post-mortem. Besides that, then you're looking at for acute fluke, looking at things like taking blood samples. So you're looking for, again, elevated liver enzymes, which indicate liver disease, or you're looking at reduced blood proteins. Now they're more non-specific, but they will point towards liver damage, but they won't tell you exactly what's causing the liver damage, but it'll give you a strong indication.
Okay, you touched on some aspects of this already, but in terms of treatment and control, using the correct products, the timing of that treatment, James, like, is there, at farm level, is there still products being used that maybe aren't effectively treating the stage of fluke we need to get at this stage of the year?
Yeah. So again, back to autumn time in sheep, and also on cattle, but autumn time, on sheep farms, September time, for example, you're going to see fluke at the varying stages, but you're going to see early stage fluke in these animals. So there's not much point in using a product, say in September, that's effective against adult fluke only, because you'll be leaving behind early immature or late immature fluke, which won't be affected by a treatment. So it's important at that stage to be targeting the early immatures, the late immatures, and of course adults as well. So a product that's effective against as many of the life cycle stages as possible. Whereas the later you get into the year, I suppose more of the fluke or maturing, etc., etc. But certainly the autumn time, you'd be looking at a product that's effective against all the different life cycle stages of the fluke.
I suppose we touched on this at the very beginning. The grazing management of sheep, we tend to leave them out for longer in cattle systems, so the risk period continues. There's a need, James, in a lot of them cases, even you did treat at that stage of the year, they're probably grazing the same pasture again. Later in the season, it's not just a case of take your eye off the ball. There's still a fluke risk. On them high risk farms are still present. Like,
yeah, the very fact that they're outside, there is a risk. So you most likely will have to go back in with pretty definitely will have to go back in with another treatment again on farms where fluke is present if animals are left outdoors, because they continually pick them up off pasture.
I suppose in some cases then that housing period potentially gives you a little bit better chance of control and using different products as the season progresses.
Yeah, like, so again, at housing, for example, in cattle, people can choose to do two things with cattle at housing. They can treat them for fluke at housing, or they can wait 6 to 8 weeks post housing and treat them. But this will be found on the Animal Health Ireland website, particularly the parasite control program. But it really depends. If you treat, say for example, cattle at housing, with a product that's effective against late immatures or adult fluke, they will have picked up, by the very virtue, they will have picked up fluke on pasture right up until the time they actually are housed. So you mightn't necessarily be treating all stages of fluke. Well, you won't be necessarily treating all stages of fluke if you're using a product against the older stages. So in those situations, you might have to do a follow up with a fecal sample 6 to 8 weeks post housing to see if they've got if they're still shedding eggs. Yeah.
James, just maybe finally, we talked a lot about liver fluke. Rumen fluke is something a lot of producers will be familiar with. Could you just maybe explain to us what it is and why it becomes a risk in certain cases and not in others?
Yeah, Ciarán, we're, like, over the last number of years, we're seeing more and more rumen fluke eggs in fecal samples submitted, and to the point that it's now much more common for us to see rumen fluke in a fecal sample, say rumen fluke eggs, than you'd see liver fluke eggs. Thing to note with rumen fluke is the adult stage in the forestomach of the animal, so it doesn't cause any real pathology. the damage is actually done by the juvenile stages in the small intestine. So you end up with, unfortunately, farms that would come across it, you end up seeing, profuse diarrhea, sudden weight loss, etc., etc. And it's due to, I suppose, it's due to a massive challenge at pasture with the insisted stages on pasture. Now both rumen fluke and liver fluke both share the same intermediate host, so the multicenarial galba truncatula. But by and large, and to be careful what I say here, but by and large, rumen fluke doesn't cause a problem. However, when we see cases of disease due to rumen fluke, they're quite dramatic. So colleagues in the Sligo RVL were anxious to point out that they've had a couple of cases in this autumn where if they come across cases of rumen fluke causing serious disease in herds. So it is important to be aware that it can cause disease. When it does, it's quite significant. But what I want to point out is that on a routine fecal sample, so I see fecal samples submitted from 6 or 7 animals in a group, whatever it is. If you get back rumen fluke eggs in a fecal sample and you're wondering what to do with the result, the first question I always ask is, if the animals look normal, no scouring, they look healthy and they're thriving okay, I would advise them not to treat. Now, in cases where fecal samples are sent into the lab from animals that are scouring and they're concerned about rumen fluke, it's important that whoever sending in samples requests the lab to test for not only the presence, to see labs as a routine will test for rumen fluke eggs anyway, if it's requested, but you can also test the fecal samples for the presence of, so the juvenile stages of rumen fluke, which may be present in the fecal sample. So if you, in those situations where if you happen to find the juvenile rumen fluke in a fecal sample and you're looking at animal scouring, well, then you pretty much join the dots and attribute that scouring to rumen fluke.
So you're getting to the root of the problem there. It's the juvenile ones are causing an issue, and you're identifying that is definitely the case, as opposed to anything else going on.
Yeah, so like again with rumen fluke, it's back to farm history. So on farms that have had previous issues with rumen fluke causing scouring in animals, well, then if you have animals scouring the following year, and and you're concerned, the rumen fluke is quite likely, but by and large it doesn't tend to cause disease. It's really only on occasion, but when it does, it can be quite dramatic. But it's important in those situations, if you're concerned about it, if an animal dies from scouring or whatever, it should be submitted to a regional lab. If it's not submitted, well, certainly the animals that are in the same group that are affected, I would be taking fecal samples of multiple animals within the same group and requesting the lab to test not only for eggs, but also for the presence of the juvenile stages of fluke.
And the juveniles are, in this case, James, they're not that hard to identify in a lab scenario.
No, I mean, I suppose we're still trying to figure out the rate of shedding, but like certainly cases we've had here, sometimes you get them in a post-mortem, so they'll when they're doing a post-mortem, they'll take samples of the gut contents, or they may take samples of fecal samples and send them in. But it's important. You mightn't always find them, but it's important to check. It is important to check. But as a general comment with rumen fluke, like the presence of rumen fluke eggs in a fecal sample of animals that are thriving and performing well, in those situations you don't need to treat. There's no evidence to suggest the treatment is warranted, and even to use products like oxychloride in animals that are clinically normal, that are healthy, etc., you are running the risk of the resistance developing to that product. And as an additional point, on farms where you've both liver fluke and rumen fluke, so if you find liver fluke eggs in a fecal sample, it is always of significance and you have to treat for it. Whereas if you find rumen fluke eggs that animals are normal, it's not a big issue. But the problem in some farms is what's happening is, because farmers are finding both there is a tendency to use a product like oxyclosinide that only works against, the older liver fluke, but it'll treat all stages of rumen fluke. So in those situations, you end up, I suppose, you're really concentrating on treating rumen fluke at the expense of controlling your liver fluke, because you're not hitting all the stages of liver fluke. So that's important to understand. Like, if people are interested, like to read the forecast in detail, because all the details are in there. And if you're still keen on reading material, I would certainly ask people to look at the Animal Health Ireland website under parasite control, because again, there's leaflets on that which cover rumen fluke, liver fluke, coccidiosis, roundworms, external parasites, the whole shebang. So it's all there in a very readable way.
I think that's maybe an excellent point to wrap it up on. James, look, I really appreciate your time today. You've gone through a lot of details you have for us. It was great to have you on. It's certainly something that needs to be on the radar for sheep farmers at the moment. And again, as you've indicated, there's plenty of means to actually test and look at what are the issues on your farm. Going to finish the episode up at this point. I have included a link in the description of this podcast to the Animal Health Ireland webpage James was referring to. It's an excellent resource with very good technical documents on it, covering liver fluke, rumen fluke, and various other aspects of animal health. I'm sure you'll find useful a page well worth visiting. That's it for me for this episode. Again, for any updates from our sheep program, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Ciarán Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tune in to future episodes.